In the quiet heart of the frontier, where every sunrise is both a blessing and a battle, a family holds together against the weight of the wilderness. A father, weathered by trials, sits with the strength of a protector etched into his face. 3 children, innocent yet brave, look to him for safety, while a mother, carrying the bread she has worked hard to make, stands as the lifeline of their survival. Here, love is not spoken in words, but in sacrifices made, in bread shared, and in the unshaken bond that keeps them standing, no matter how hard the winds of life may blow. This is not just a family, this is the spirit of resilience, carved into the very soul of the West. The prairie wind howled against the sagging wooden boards of the ranch house, rattling loose shutters and carrying with it the dust of a land that gave little and demanded much. Inside, the smell of sour milk and damp laundry clung to the air, mingling with the faint, ever-present scent of wood smoke. A man sat slumped in a chair by the fire, his broad shoulders bent, his hat resting on the table beside him. He had been strong once, the kind of man who could break wild horses or spend 12 hours in the saddle without flinching, but grief had a way of breaking even the strongest oak. His wife had been gone only 6 weeks, and still he woke in the night expecting to hear her soft voice humming lullabies, only to be greeted by silence broken by the cries of 4 babies too young to understand why their world had suddenly changed. The oldest was barely 4, a little girl with tangled hair and wide, tearful eyes who clung to his leg whenever he tried to leave the room. The twin boys, only 2, were wild and restless, tumbling over one another in chaos that left him breathless with exhaustion. And then there was the baby, a newborn so tiny she seemed more fragile than a bird's wing, her cries slicing through his weary body like a blade. He tried, God knew he tried, to feed them, to change them, to soothe them when the nights stretched endless and lonely. But what did a cowboy know about raising 4 children on his own? His hands were calloused from ropes and rifles, not delicate enough for the soft skin of infants. His voice was rough from shouting cattle, not gentle enough to replace a mother's song. Yet they were his, and he loved them with a ferocity that tore at his chest even as despair threatened to drown him. The ranch had begun to fall into disrepair, chores left undone as he stumbled from one crisis to the next. Fences sagged, the barn roof leaked, and the cattle wandered without proper care. Neighbors came by with food sometimes, leaving pies or jars of beans on the porch, but no one stayed long. They shook their heads and muttered that it was too much for one man, that he ought to send the children to relatives or even an orphanage until he could get back on his feet. The thought filled him with rage, but deep down he feared they might be right. He prayed in the dark, begging God for strength, but each morning he woke weaker, more lost. It was on one of those mornings, when his head throbbed from lack of sleep and the baby's cries pierced the air like a relentless alarm, that he heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on the frosted earth outside. He nearly ignored it, thinking it was just another neighbor come to offer pity he didn't want. But then there was a knock, gentle but steady, on the front door. He hesitated, wiping his face with a shaking hand, before pulling it open. There she stood, framed by the pale winter sunlight, a woman he had never seen before. Her dress was plain, her shawl patched and worn, but there was something in her eyes that struck him immediately. She carried no judgment, no pity, only a quiet strength that seemed to steady the air between them. In her hands she held a small, round loaf of bread, its crust golden and steaming as though she had pulled it straight from the oven moments before. She lifted it slightly, her voice soft but firm. "You look like you could use this." For a moment, he could not speak. Words lodged in his throat as his gaze shifted from the bread to her face, then back again. He had been offered food before, but never like this. Never with such warmth, such a sense of purpose. He stepped aside, too weary to question why a stranger had appeared on his porch with bread in her hands. She entered, her eyes immediately drawn to the chaos within, the unwashed dishes, the scattered toys, the children clinging to his legs or staring with wide, uncertain eyes. Her expression softened as she set the bread on the table and crouched down to meet the gaze of the little girl. "Hello, sweetheart," she murmured. "Are you hungry?" The child nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Without hesitation, the woman tore the loaf into pieces, the smell of fresh yeast filling the room. She handed a piece to each child, her hands gentle, her smile calm. They devoured it eagerly, crumbs scattering, their cries replaced by the sound of chewing. The baby, still wailing in his cradle, drew her attention next. She lifted the infant with practiced ease, cradling her against her chest, rocking gently until the cries subsided. The cowboy watched, his heart twisting as he realized how natural it looked, this stranger holding his child as though she had always belonged there. He wanted to ask who she was, why she had come, but the words felt too heavy. Instead, he muttered, "I don't even know your name." She glanced up, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "My name is Clara," she said simply. "And you look like a man who's been carrying more than one soul should ever have to bear." Something in her tone cracked the dam inside him. He turned away, his chest heaving, fighting back the tears he had sworn never to shed again. For weeks he had hidden his pain behind silence, behind gritted teeth and clenched fists. But now, with this woman in his home, with the smell of bread in the air and his children momentarily soothed, the weight broke him. His shoulders shook, his breath ragged, and before he could stop himself, a sob escaped his lips. Clara said nothing. She did not rush to comfort him, did not speak words that would sound hollow. She only continued to rock the baby, her presence steady, her silence more powerful than any sermon. Slowly, the cowboy sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face, until the storm of grief ebbed enough for him to breathe again. When he finally looked up, Clara was still there, her gaze calm, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. For the first time since his wife's death, the cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It felt alive. As the day wore on, Clara stayed. She swept the floor, washed the dishes, and coaxed laughter from the children with gentle games. She moved through the house not as a guest, not as a neighbor offering charity, but as though she belonged there, as though she had stepped into a role she had been destined for all along. The cowboy said little, still stunned by her presence, but he watched, and with every passing moment, the knot in his chest loosened. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, Clara rose to leave. The children clung to her skirts, their little voices pleading for her to stay. She smiled softly, pressing kisses to their foreheads before turning to the cowboy. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "And the next day, if you'll have me. No man should raise 4 children alone. No man should carry grief without someone to share it." He opened his mouth to protest, to ask why she would do such a thing for a stranger. But the words caught in his throat when he saw the certainty in her eyes. She wasn't offering charity, she was offering something deeper, something he didn't yet dare name. He only nodded, his voice low and hoarse. "Thank you." And so it began, with a knock at the door, a loaf of bread, and a woman who refused to turn away from a broken man and 4 hungry children. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, the cowboy felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. The next morning came with a gray sky and the chill of wind that carried the scent of distant rain. The cowboy stirred from restless sleep, his hat still clutched in one hand as he lay slumped in the chair near the hearth. The baby had cried through much of the night, and though he had tried, his clumsy hands and exhausted eyes had not brought her much comfort. He awoke with the sound of tiny feet pattering across the wooden floorboards, his oldest tugging gently at his arm. "Papa," she whispered, her eyes wide and hopeful, "is the bread lady coming back?" The words struck him with a mix of sorrow and unexpected warmth. Bread lady. Clara had been here only once, and already his children spoke of her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for family. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, unsure what to tell them. He did not know if she truly meant it, if she would return as she had promised. People said many things out of kindness in the moment, but few followed through when the burden became real. But as the morning stretched on and the clouds thickened, he heard it again, the crunch of footsteps outside, the steady rhythm of someone unafraid to walk the long miles it took to reach his isolated ranch. His chest tightened, and when the knock came, the children ran before he could even rise, pulling the door open with squeals of delight. There she was, Clara, standing in the threshold with another loaf of bread in her hands, this one larger than before. She smiled at the children as though she had known them her whole life, then lifted her gaze to the cowboy. "I told you I'd come back." Something inside him eased, a knot of doubt unraveling. She was a woman of her word. He stepped aside without a word, watching as she swept into the room, her shawl damp from the mist outside. Once again, she moved with quiet purpose, feeding the children first, her laughter soft as crumbs gathered on their cheeks. She seemed to know instinctively what each child needed, patience for the oldest, playfulness for the twins, gentle rocking for the baby. It was a skill he did not possess, one that humbled him to the core. As the day wore on, Clara did more than tend to the children. She set her hands to the ranch itself, sweeping floors, mending torn linens, even stepping outside to haul water from the well. At first, The cowboy tried to protest, mumbling that she needn't trouble herself, but Clara silenced him with a look that carried both firmness and kindness, the kind of look his late wife once gave him when she was determined to help whether he liked it or not. He found himself falling into step beside her, doing chores he had neglected, his weariness lifting bit by bit in her presence. By late afternoon, the rain came in earnest, drumming against the roof and turning the earth outside into slick mud. Clara stayed, trapped by the storm, but neither she nor the children seemed to mind. She gathered them around the hearth, telling stories of her childhood, of farm fields and wildflowers, of long summers where the world seemed endless. Her voice was soft but strong, weaving pictures in the air that held the children spellbound. The cowboy sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed not on the fire, but on her. For the first time in weeks, he felt something stir within him that was not grief. It was dangerous, that feeling, one he tried to bury. He had loved his wife with all he was, and she was gone. It seemed wrong, almost disloyal, to feel the faint stirrings of admiration for another woman. And yet, as Clara's laughter filled the room, as her hands brushed against his while she passed him a plate of bread, he could not deny the truth. She was not his wife. But she was something. As night fell and the storm eased, Clara rose to leave. The children wailed, clinging to her skirts once more, their little hearts unwilling to let her go. She knelt, kissing their cheeks, promising she would return. Then she turned to him, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "You're doing better already," she said softly. "Don't give up on yourself, or on them." He wanted to ask why she kept coming, why she gave her time and her hands and her heart to a man she barely knew. But the words stuck, and he only nodded. She left into the damp night, her figure fading into the mist, leaving behind the smell of bread, the sound of children's laughter, and the faintest glimmer of hope in his chest. The days that followed became a rhythm, almost like a new life blooming from the ashes of the old. Each morning, Clara came, always with something in her hands, sometimes bread, sometimes milk, sometimes only a basket of simple tools to mend what was broken. And each time, she brought more than food or help. She brought steadiness, laughter, and warmth. The children clung to her as though she were a second mother, and he, though he tried to remain guarded, found himself waiting for her footsteps, listening for her knock. One afternoon, while the twins napped and the baby slept in her cradle, he found Clara out by the barn, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand as she worked to patch a sagging door. He stopped in his tracks, watching her drive the nail with sure strikes, her brow furrowed in concentration. It stirred something deep within him, admiration, respect, even awe. She was not delicate in the way society often demanded of women. She was strong, capable, unafraid to take on work that would have daunted most. When she caught him staring, she laughed lightly. "Don't look so surprised," she teased. "I've been fixing things since I was old enough to lift a hammer." A woman alone doesn't have much choice. Her words gave him pause. He realized then how little he knew of her. She had walked into his life like a miracle, but she was no ghost. She was flesh and blood, with a past of her own. He wanted to ask her about it, about where she came from and what had brought her here. But once again, the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he simply took the hammer from her hand, their fingers brushing briefly, sending a strange current through him. "You shouldn't have to fix everything alone," he said gruffly. For a heartbeat, their eyes held. Neither spoke, but something unspoken passed between them, something too fragile and too powerful to name. He turned away, driving the next nail with unnecessary force, as though to silence the feelings rising inside him. That night, after she left, he sat by the fire long after the children had fallen asleep. The baby's tiny breaths rose and fell softly, the crackle of the logs filling the silence. He stared at the shadows on the wall, wrestling with the truth. He could no longer deny that Clara was more than a helper. She was becoming a part of them, weaving herself into the fabric of his life and his children's lives with every passing day. And though he feared what it meant, though he wondered if it was right to let another woman into a place his wife once held, he could not stop it. Clara was here. Clara was changing everything, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was exactly what God intended. The weeks rolled into months, and the quiet rhythm of life on the ranch changed in ways the cowboy had never expected. He had once believed his world had ended with his wife's death, that he was doomed to stumble through grief while trying to keep 4 children alive with his clumsy, calloused hands. Yet somehow, without fanfare, Clara had slipped into their lives like the steady light of dawn after a storm. She was not loud about it, nor did she ask for gratitude. She simply was, present each day, her footsteps at the door, her laughter in the kitchen, her hands mending, cooking, cleaning, and holding the children as though they were her own. The children thrived under her care. Their cheeks grew rounder, their laughter louder, their tears fewer. Even the baby, once so frail, grew stronger, soothed not only by bottles of milk but by the warmth of Clara's arms, by the songs she hummed in a voice soft enough to calm the hardest storms. The cowboy saw it all and wrestled silently with his feelings, caught between loyalty to the wife he had buried and the growing love he could no longer deny. It was not only within his house that changes took root. The neighbors, who had once kept their distance, began to whisper. Clara had lived alone on the edge of town for years, her own story marked by hardship and loss. People called her kind but strange, a woman who carried her burdens quietly and had little need for others. Now they saw her walking daily to the cowboy's ranch, carrying bread or milk or baskets of mended clothes, and their tongues wagged like restless dogs. One afternoon, while he hitched the wagon, an old friend rode by and leaned down from his saddle. "You know what folks are sayin'?" the man asked, his tone half amused, half warning. "They say Clarice moved in your heart as much as she's moved into your home." The cowboy tightened the strap on the horse, his jaw stiff. "Let folks say what they want," he muttered. But later, alone in the barn, the words rang in his ears. He did not care for gossip, but he cared deeply about honor, about what was right in the eyes of God and in the eyes of his children. If Clara stayed too long in his life without clarity, tongues would not only wag, they would poison. He knew the day would come when he would have to speak, when silence would no longer be enough. That day arrived sooner than expected. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the plains in fire and gold, Clara lingered longer than usual. The children had begged her to stay, and she did, helping to put them to bed, tucking each one in with a kiss and a whispered prayer. When the last door closed and the house fell quiet, the cowboy found her standing by the hearth, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, the firelight turning her hair to copper. "You've given them more than I ever could," he said softly, his voice rough with the weight of his confession. "You've given them back their laughter. You've given me back hope." Clara turned, her eyes wide, a tremor in her breath. "I only wanted to help. That's all. But it's more than help," he pressed, stepping closer. "Clara, every day, I wait for your footsteps. Every night, I see the way they love you. And he broke off, his throat tight. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy but not empty. She lowered her gaze, her hands twisting in her shawl. "I never meant to take her place," she whispered. "Your wife, she was good, and she was loved. I could never." He reached out, his rough hand closing gently over hers, stilling their restless motion. "You're not taking her place," he said, his voice steadier now. "No one ever could. But Clara, my heart, it's found room for you too. And if you'll let me, if you'll let us, I'd ask you to stay, not just as their helper, not just as their friend, but as my partner, as their mother in truth." Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes, spilling freely now as she looked up at him. "Do you mean that?" "I've never meant anything more." The fire cracked, the night held its breath, and in that moment, with a single nod, Clara's answer was given. She stayed. Word spread quickly, as it always did, but this time the whispers carried a different tone. Some called it scandalous, others called it providence, but the cowboy did not care. His children had found their laughter. His home had found its warmth, and his heart had found its second chance. On a clear morning weeks later, under the open sky and the blessing of a preacher, Clara became his wife. She wore no jewels, only a simple dress, her hands folded around his, her eyes shining with quiet certainty. The children clung to her skirts during the vows, their voices breaking into cheers when the preacher declared them bound. The cowboy bent to kiss her softly, reverently, not as a man desperate with loneliness, but as a man redeemed by grace. Life on the ranch was never easy. There were storms and droughts, sicknesses and struggles, but through it all, Clara stood at his side, her strength a match to his. She taught the children lessons of kindness and faith, she filled their table with bread and laughter, and she filled the cowboy's nights with peace. Years later, when the children were grown and the ranch had weathered its share of seasons, the cowboy would often sit on the porch, his hand entwined with Clara's, watching the sunset with gratitude in his eyes. He would think back to that first day, to the door creaking open, to the smell of fresh bread carried in her arms, and he would know with every fiber of his being that God had answered his prayers not with thunder, but with a quiet knock on the door and a woman brave enough to walk in. And whenever his grandchildren asked for a story, he would tell them about the bread lady who saved a family with kindness, and how a broken cowboy found not just survival, but love, in the simplest of gifts. Not a miracle of lightning, but a miracle of bread, and of the woman who carried it.